March 24th, 1944. The night sky over Germany burns red. Below, the forests of Brandenburg stretch like a frozen sea. Above them, a dying Lancaster bomber spins through the darkness, shedding fragments of flame. Inside its shattered tail, 21-year-old Nicholas Alkmaid is no longer fighting the fire. He's watching it consume his world. His turret is an iron coffin. The plexiglass is cracked, the oxygen mask half melted against his cheek. The smell of burning hydraulic fluid mixes with cordite and smoke. Somewhere forward in the fuselage, voices scream through the intercom, but the wires have already melted, and the headset hisses with static. The aircraft lurches violently as the wing disintegrates. The bomber is finished. He turns to reach for his parachute, but it's already gone. The fire has reached the stowage compartment. What remains of the silk burns with a dull orange glow. The temperature rises past endurance. His eyebrows are gone. His gloved hands blister inside the leather. Every instinct tells him to stay, to fight the fire, to crawl toward the hatch. But the heat is unbearable. There is no parachute, no way out. Through the small glass window, he can see the endless black sky below, 18,000 feet of empty air. He has a few seconds left to make a decision that no one should ever have to make. Burn alive or fall into nothing. He takes a deep breath, feeling his lungs burn with smoke. The smell of his own uniform smouldering fills his nostrils. The turret creaks, metal warping, fire snapping at the edges. And then, calmly, almost as if accepting an invitation, Nicholas Alkmaid unlocks the hatch. The wind tears him into the void. The world becomes silence. The fire vanishes. The plane, the screams, the chaos, all gone. Only the stars remain, spinning above him like shards of broken glass. His arms spread instinctively, the cold hitting like a wall. The fall begins. 18,000 feet between life, death, and something no man can explain. He doesn't scream. He simply whispers into the rushing air. So this is how it ends. Freeze frame in time. The wind is a living thing, clawing at his face, ripping the air from his lungs. Yet amid that chaos, something strange happens. Time slows down. Nicholas Alkmaid is falling through absolute darkness, but his mind begins to light up with fragments of memory. Faces, laughter, the soft glow of a pub back home in Loughborough. The sound of a gramophone spinning, "We'll meet again." Then, the sudden image of the men he'd flown with for months, his crew, his brothers, vanishing into the fire above. He feels no panic now, only a kind of detached clarity. Below him, the world is a black ocean. Above him, the Lancaster breaks apart, flames curling like ribbons before disappearing into night. Tiny sparks, debris, maybe souls, drift beside him before being swallowed by the dark. He wonders if any of them jumped in too, or if he's alone in this final descent. The altimeter on his wrist is useless. Its needle spins wildly in the freezing wind. His flight suit, still smouldering at the edges, cools fast as the air thins. The oxygen deprivation sets in. His vision tunnels, then sharpens. The pain fades. There's only awareness of motion, of gravity, of the soft whistle of air sliding past his ears. He remembers what the instructor at Woolfolk's Lodge had once said, half jokingly, "If you ever fall without a chute, make sure to aim for trees and snow. Won't save you, but you'll leave a prettier corpse." He almost laughs. Almost, because that's exactly what's waiting below. The dim outline of a dark forest, dusted with snow. A prettier grave than fire, perhaps. But it's not over yet. His body, spinning gently now, drifts in a kind of eerie balance. He spreads his arms, trying to slow the descent. Instinct, not logic. The wind howls in response, shredding his thoughts. And yet, beneath it all, something quiet moves inside him. A simple, unshakable realization. He's not afraid anymore. For the first time that night, Nicholas Alkmaid feels something that doesn't belong in war. Peace. The world above is gone. The world below hasn't arrived. He's suspended between both, untouched, unseen. And for a few seconds, it feels like he's floating, not falling. The night raid over Berlin. Hours earlier, before the flames, before the fall, the night had been like any other mission. RAF Wychford, March 24th, 1944. Ground crews moved like ghosts under blackout lamps, silhouettes against the massive wings of Avro Lancasters lined up for takeoff. The air smelled of fuel and frost. Over 800 bombers were being prepared for yet another assault on Berlin. The 25th in a series of night raids meant to cripple what was left of Germany's war machine. Inside Lancaster DS-64, Nicholas Alkmaid adjusted the straps of his turret harness. He had done this dozens of times before, mechanical, practiced, precise. The rear turret, his domain, was isolated at the far end of the aircraft, a world apart from the crew. He sat alone, encased in plexiglass and steel, surrounded by 4 Browning 303 machine guns, his only companions. Over the intercom came the voice of his pilot, Flying Officer James Newman, calm but clipped. "Check in, lads." One by one, the voices echoed through the static. Navigator, bomb aimer, wireless operator, mid-upper gunner. Then his own, quiet but steady. Tail gunner ready. The engines roared to life, a deep mechanical thunder that rolled across the tarmac. The vibration ran through his boots, through his bones. As the bomber lumbered down the runway, Nicholas glanced at the pale outline of the control tower, receding into darkness. Somewhere below, the ground crew saluted. Tiny human figures fading beneath 4 roaring engines that carried death across the channel. Once airborne, the routine took over. Climb, formation, heading east. At 18,000 feet, the sky stretched infinite and merciless. Below, a black void. Above, the stars, so many that they almost looked like flak bursts waiting to happen. He checked his guns, scanned the horizon. His breath froze on the inside of the glass dome. Then, far ahead, the glow of Berlin appeared, an orange wound on the earth. Fires still smouldered from previous raids, painting the horizon in a dull, unending twilight. The bomber streams stretched for miles, each aircraft carrying tons of explosives, each one a flickering speck of light against the abyss. In his turret, Nicholas felt the familiar isolation, the strange, suspended loneliness of being the last man on the plane, the rear eyes of the crew. He knew his role: to watch, to wait, to kill if he must. He didn't know that, within hours, the city below would claim the plane, his crew, and everything's. He thought he knew about life and death. Inside the Lancaster, inside the belly of the Lancaster, war felt both enormous and intimate. Each man had his small world, a few square feet of space, a task, a rhythm. The pilot, James Newman, sat high in the cockpit, surrounded by instruments glowing faintly green. To his right, the flight engineer monitored fuel lines and gauges, his gloved fingers twitching like a pianist's. Farther back, the navigator bent over a map, the red pencil tracing their course toward Berlin. The bomb aimer crouched near the nose, staring down through his bomb sight, while the wireless operator adjusted frequencies, listening through static for commands from base. And then there was Nicholas, alone in the tail turret, 70 feet behind everyone else, connected only by a wire and a voice. The bomber flexed and groaned in the cold, and with every vibration, he felt more detached from the others. His world was 4 guns, 2 foot pedals, and a small control stick that turned the turret like a machine of its own. He loved it, though he'd never admit it. There was something pure about being the rear gunner. No navigation, no strategy, just reaction and nerve. He could see everything behind them, the endless dark, the distant spark of flak, the eerie flashes of other bombers being hit miles away. Tonight, the air was deceptively calm. He scanned the horizon, a constant, disciplined sweep, left to right, right to left. The dull hum of engines and oxygen hisses filled his ears. The temperature outside was -40. Frost crept up the inner edges of the turret glass, fracturing into patterns that looked like white fire. Then, a faint glimmer, too small for a star, too steady for reflection. He leaned forward, adjusting the turret slightly. Another light appeared, then another. He knew what that meant. Night fighters. He pressed the intercom switch. Skipper, we might have company. The pilot's voice came back calm, controlled. Keep eyes on them. Rear. We're crossing into flak zone. He exhaled slowly, locking his harness tighter. Somewhere in the dark, someone else was doing the same. A German pilot, eyes fixed on radar, preparing to climb beneath them. The night's silence was an illusion, and he knew it. At any second, it would shatter, replaced by fire, steel, and screams carried away by the wind. He didn't know that this would be the last time he'd ever speak to his crew. The attack begins. It started with a flicker. 1 second, a faint glow beneath the clouds. The next, a streak of orange that ripped through the black sky like lightning. Tracer, 6 o'clock low, Nicholas shouted into the intercom. The words barely left his mouth before the Lancaster shook violently. A burst of cannon fire tore through the fuselage, the metallic shriek of impact echoing through his turret. The tail section lurched, control cables snapping under the force. He swung his guns toward the flash, saw it, clear as day, the unmistakable twin-engine outline of a Junkers Ju-88, its nose guns spitting fire. "Enemy fighter, engaging!" he yelled, squeezing the triggers. The 4 Brownings roared to life, their vibration hammering through the turret walls. Red tracers carved through the night, streaking toward the German fighter. He saw sparks dance across its right wing. A hit, maybe, but the enemy didn't break off. Another burst slammed into them. The starboard wing erupted in flame. The aircraft pitched sideways, the interior exploding in a blinding orange flash. Nicholas's world became a maelstrom. Fire, smoke, metal fragments slicing through the air. He caught a glimpse through the glass. The mid-upper gunner's turret gone, a ragged hole where it had been. The intercom crackled with chaos. Voices screaming, cut short, the pilot trying to keep control. "We've lost starboard engine. Prepare to bail." The rest was swallowed by static. Nicholas swung his turret, searching for another target, but the night was pure fire now. The bomber was spiraling, altitude dropping fast. Flames crept along the wings, licking at the fuselage like living creatures. The oxygen lines ruptured, the hiss of escaping gas mixing with the roar of burning fuel. He knew they were done. "Tail gunner, bail out! Bail out!" The command came through in fragments, desperate and distant. He turned to reach for his parachute pack, mounted just behind the turret, and froze. The fire had already found it. What remained of the canvas and silk was melting, dripping down the fuselage like wax. Smoke filled his lungs. The turret glass was fogging with soot. His body screamed to move, but he was trapped. Harness, cables, the confined metal space that now felt like a coffin. He looked up once more, saw the night sky through cracked glass, stars blurring as the aircraft tumbled. Then, almost without thinking, he made his choice. He unlocked the turret hatch. The Inferno's roar gave way to silence, as the freezing air swallowed him whole. 18,000 feet below, a forest waited. The freefall. The moment he fell, the world stopped making sense. There was no ground, no horizon, only blackness, cold, and motion. The air hit like a physical blow, freezing the moisture in his eyes, flattening his clothes against his body. The temperature outside was 40 degrees below zero. Every breath felt like inhaling shards of glass. But Nicholas Alcemade wasn't screaming. He was too stunned for fear. The fire, the noise, the chaos, all of it vanished the instant he left the aircraft. Now, there was only wind. Endless, deafening wind. He looked up and saw the remains of the Lancaster above him. A falling star made of twisted fire. It broke apart silently, scattering pieces of metal that glowed briefly before disappearing into the dark. Somewhere in that wreck, he knew, his friends were still inside. That thought hit harder than the fall itself. He tried to move, but the wind pinned him flat. His limbs flailed helplessly. The earth was somewhere below, invisible, waiting. The descent felt both eternal and instantaneous. His brain refused to measure time anymore. Seconds felt like minutes. Minutes felt like eternity. He turned his body instinctively, trying to control his fall. He remembered the instructor's voice from training. Spread out, slow the drop, aim for trees or snow. It echoed faintly in his mind, a useless mantra against gravity. Then, the cold began to fade. A strange warmth crept into his fingers, his face, his chest. Hypoxia. He was losing consciousness, his body shutting down in the thin air. Yet, in that final clarity before blackout, something shifted inside him. He wasn't thinking of death anymore. He was thinking of peace. He thought of home, of the narrow street in Loughborough, where he'd walked as a boy, of the scent of rain on brick, of his mother's voice calling him in from the cold. He closed his eyes and whispered, barely audible through the wind, "If this is it, let it be quick." And then, a faint sound beneath the roar, a distant whoosh, like air through branches. The dark below was no longer empty. Shapes were forming. Trees, thousands of them, a black sea of pine. He didn't see the ground rise to meet him. He only felt it. Branches snapped. The world exploded into white pain. Then, silence. Nicholas Alkmaid had just fallen 18,000 feet, without a parachute, and he was still alive. The forest of miracles. Silence. For a long time, there was only that. No wind, no fire, no sound of war, just the faint creak of snow-laden branches swaying above him. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. His vision was blurry, his body heavy, every breath shallow. He tried to move, but something sharp pressed into his back. Pine needles, broken twigs, and the soft cushion of snow. The faint smell of sap and smoke mixed in the cold air. He blinked once, twice. Then the realization began to form. He wasn't dead. The memory of falling came flooding back. The spinning darkness, the scream of the wind, the impact that should have shattered every bone in his body. He flexed his fingers. They moved. His legs, bruised, aching, but intact. He touched his face, expecting blood or burns. Nothing. Just frost. Slowly, he lifted his head. The world above him was a web of broken branches. The pine trees, thick and close together, had caught him like a net, their interlocking limbs slowing his fall in a way that defied all probability. Below that, a thick layer of snow, soft enough to absorb the final impact. Nature itself had conspired to save him. He stared upward, breath forming small clouds. His turret suit was torn, his boots half frozen. His right wrist throbbed with pain, but he was breathing, alive in the middle of a forest in enemy territory, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the echo of the impossible. He laughed, not out of humour, but disbelief, a sound between a sob and a gasp. It echoed faintly through the trees. 18,000 feet, he muttered, and I'm still here. The absurdity of it struck him like lightning. Every rule of physics, every law of war, every whisper of fate, broken. No parachute, no miracle intervention, just luck, trees, snow, and something else, something he couldn't name. The cold began to bite again. His hands shook. Pain was creeping in from the shock wearing off. He looked around. Dark forest, moonlight filtering through snow-laden branches. Somewhere distant, dogs barked. He realized then, survival was only the beginning. He was deep inside Nazi-occupied Germany, injured, unarmed, and alone. And while gravity had failed to kill him, the war might not make the same mistake twice. Alone in enemy territory, the cold cut through his uniform like knives. Nicholas forced himself upright, his body trembling uncontrollably. Every breath burned, every movement sent pain flaring up his spine. He reached for his pocket watch, miraculously still intact, and saw the faint outline of 12:45 a.m. Only minutes had passed since the fall, yet the world felt entirely different now. Quiet, still, hostile. The forest around him was endless. The snow muffled every sound except the distant echo of barking dogs, and farther still, the faint hum of engines. German search parties, most likely. The night air carried the smell of smoke from burning wreckage. His Lancaster was somewhere out there, a grave of twisted aluminum and ash. He stood slowly, testing his legs. They held. A dull throb pulsed in his right knee, but it wasn't broken. His wrist hurt worse, probably sprained. He looked down at his uniform, scorched and torn. The RAF insignia, still faintly visible on his sleeve, was now a beacon of danger in enemy land. He tore it off, stuffing it into his pocket. Instinct took over. The same discipline drilled into every airman. Evade, hide, survive. He started walking, each step crunching softly in the snow. The forest canopy swallowed what little moonlight remained, and soon he was moving in near-total darkness. He thought of his crew, Newman, Harris, Bill, Jack, his brothers in the sky. The image of the burning Lancaster replayed behind his eyes, looping endlessly. He wanted to believe they'd made it out, that maybe someone else had jumped, maybe someone else was alive out there. But a deeper part of him already knew the truth. Hours passed, or maybe it was just one. The forest began to thin, revealing faint shapes in the distance. Farmhouses, fences, the ghostly line of a road. He crouched behind a fallen log, scanning for movement. The dogs were closer now. He needed shelter, food, a plan. He was behind enemy lines with no map, no weapon, no parachute, and no hope of reaching Allied territory on foot. The temperature was dropping fast. If the Germans didn't find him, the cold would. He muttered under his breath, half prayer, half defiance. "You didn't let me fall to die like this." And so he kept moving, one step at a time, deeper into the woods, guided only by instinct and the fragile rhythm of his own heartbeat, unaware that by morning, the very enemy he feared would become his unlikely salvation, captured by the enemy. Dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through the trees, revealing the scars of his survival. The snow around him was dotted with blood, where sharp branches had torn his suit. His breath rose in clouds as he trudged toward a faint sound. Voices, German, carried by the wind. He stopped instantly, heart pounding. The barking dogs had returned, closer now. He knew he couldn't outrun them. His body was running on willpower alone. The temperature had dropped even further, his fingers stiff and pale. He tried to crouch behind a fallen pine, but before he could move, the sharp crack of a rifle split the air. "Halt! Hände hoch!" The words cut through the forest like the snap of a whip. He froze, turned slowly. Two German soldiers stood a few yards away, rifles aimed squarely at him. Behind them, a pair of shepherd dogs strained against their leashes, teeth bared. Nicholas raised his hands. The pain from his wrist flared, but he kept them high. The soldiers advanced cautiously, eyes flicking to his uniform. One of them frowned, muttering to the other in disbelief. The RAF insignia, half burned but visible, gave him away instantly. They shouted another order. He didn't understand every word, but the meaning was clear. Move. As they marched him toward a clearing, he saw smoke rising in the distance, black and oily, curling from what remained of his bomber. His chest tightened. That was where his friends had died. The soldiers pushed him forward roughly, but there was confusion in their tone. One of them asked something that made the other laugh. Short, sharp, disbelieving. They couldn't fathom how this man, in a half-burned uniform, without a parachute, had survived. When they reached the crash site, more soldiers stood among the wreckage. The Lancaster was unrecognizable, just a twisted skeleton of metal, still smouldering. They searched it thoroughly, counting the bodies. There were 6, only one missing. Then, one of the officers turned to Nicholas and barked something sharp in German, pointing at the sky, mimicking a falling motion. Nicholas understood. He nodded once and said quietly, in broken German, "Ja, gefallen, kein Fallschirm." Fell, no parachute. The laughter stopped. The officer stared at him for a long moment, eyes narrowing, as if trying to see the lie. But there was none. Finally, the man muttered something to his comrades. Their expressions shifted from suspicion to shock, then something almost like respect. Nicholas Alcemade, the man who had fallen 18,000 feet without a parachute, was led away, not as an enemy, but as a living impossibility. The interrogation They took him to a farmhouse that had been converted into a makeshift command post. A flickering oil lamp on a wooden table, maps pinned to the walls, and the faint hum of radio chatter in the next room. Nicholas was pushed onto a chair, his wrists bound loosely with cord. A German officer entered, tall, composed, and unsettlingly calm. His uniform was immaculate, his movements measured. This wasn't a frontline soldier. This was an investigator. "Name," the officer demanded in English, clipped but clear. "Nicholas, Alchemade, Sergeant, Royal Air Force." The officer nodded slightly, jotting it down. Then, without looking up, he asked, "Parachute?" Nicholas shook his head. "Didn't have one." The officer stopped writing. Slowly, he raised his eyes. "No parachute?" Nicholas simply repeated, "None." It burned before I could reach it. The room went still. Even the guards at the door shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. The officer's tone changed, no longer sharp, but curious. "And you lived?" Nicholas nodded once. "Seems that way." The officer studied him for a long moment, then stood and began pacing. He asked again, in German this time, speaking to the others, disbelieving, maybe mocking. The guards murmured, and one even laughed quietly. But when the officer turned back, his expression had hardened again. "You expect me to believe this story?" he said. "You fell from the sky without a parachute and lived?" Nicholas said nothing. His silence wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion. The officer slammed a hand on the table. "Do you take us for fools?" Still nothing. Nicholas just met his gaze, calm, steady. There was no arrogance in his eyes, only a simple, weary truth that didn't need defense. Minutes passed. Then something changed. The officer gestured to a guard and barked an order. They brought in a small box. Charred metal, part of an aircraft frame. The officer pointed at it. "Your plane?" Nicholas nodded. The officer turned to one of his men, who whispered something back. Then he looked at Nicholas again, his voice lower now. "They found where you landed," he said. "The snow, the trees." He hesitated, as though saying the next words went against reason itself. "It appears you tell the truth." The room was silent. No one spoke. For a long time, the only sound was the faint hiss of the lantern and the slow, deliberate scratching of the officer's pen as he wrote down the impossible. Nicholas Alchemade was no longer a prisoner to interrogate. He was an anomaly to witness. By morning, word had spread through the camp like wildfire. The story sounded too absurd to be real. An RAF sergeant who had fallen 3 miles without a parachute and survived. Yet, here he was, sitting quietly on a wooden cot, sipping weak coffee from a tin cup, his face pale but unbroken. The guards didn't quite know what to make of him. Some treated him with curiosity, others with a kind of wary reverence, as though proximity to his luck might invite divine favour. Or defy it. Then came the photographer. A German officer entered the barrack with a camera slung around his neck, an old Leica gleaming under the dim light. He was accompanied by 2 others, one carrying a notepad. Without a word, they gestured for Nicholas to stand. He obeyed, though his leg trembled under the weight. They positioned him against the wall, the same way they might document a wrecked plane or a captured pilot. But this was different. The air felt heavier, charged with something no one could name. The officer looked through the viewfinder, hesitated, then lowered the camera slightly. "Look at me," he said, in halting English. Nicholas raised his eyes. The officer studied him, not like an enemy, but like a man standing in front of something that shouldn't exist. "You fell and lived," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he clicked the shutter. Once, twice, a third time. Each flash of light carved the moment into permanence. When it was done, the officer turned to the others. "Send these to Berlin," he said. "They will not believe it unless they see his face." As they left, Nicholas sat back down, the cords around his wrists now gone. A guard placed a loaf of bread beside him, muttering something soft in German. A word Nicholas didn't understand, but whose tone he did. Respect. Hours later, the same officer returned, carrying one of the photographs still wet from the darkroom. He placed it gently on the table in front of Nicholas. "You should keep this," he said quietly. "So when they ask, you can prove it was not a dream." Nicholas stared at the photo. His own face looked back, weary, soot-streaked, eyes hollow, but alive. Proof of the fall, proof of the impossible. He never asked for the picture, but in that frozen image, the war paused, not for nations or victories, but for the quiet miracle of a man who refused to die. Proof of the impossible. 2 days later, Nicholas was moved to a larger camp deeper inside Germany, a Luftwaffe-run facility for captured airmen. His wrists were no longer bound. The guards treated him not as a typical prisoner, but almost as a guest whose story had already outgrown the wire fences surrounding him. When he arrived, British and Allied prisoners crowded the barracks windows, watching the new arrival being escorted inside. Word spread faster than orders. That's the one who fell without a parachute. At first, no one believed it. Every man there had seen death from the sky, parachutes that didn't open, planes that never leveled out, explosions that erased names. But Nicholas's calm, almost embarrassed confirmation silenced the laughter. 3 miles? One airman asked in disbelief. Nicholas nodded quietly. 18,000 feet. A low whistle cut the air. Someone muttered, "You're joking." He wasn't. That night, around the potbelly stove in the center of the barracks, he told the story for the first time in full. How the flames swallowed his cockpit, how the hatch jammed, how he jumped knowing it was the end. He didn't dramatize it, didn't boast. He spoke slowly, with the steady clarity of a man who had already made peace with death once. The others listened in complete silence. When he described landing in the pine trees, one pilot leaned forward and asked, "You mean you actually walked away?" Nicholas managed a tired smile. "Walked, yes. Limped, more like." The room erupted, not with disbelief this time, but awe. A man who had outlived gravity itself sat in front of them. In a war where the sky had devoured thousands, his survival felt like divine interference. The camp commandant himself came later that week, a stern Luftwaffe colonel with sharp eyes and precise speech. He questioned Nicholas again, this time more methodically. Coordinates, altitude, type of aircraft, mission objective. Every detail noted carefully. At the end of the interview, the colonel folded his papers, stood, and said something Nicholas would never forget. "Sergeant Alkmaid, you are the only man I have ever known who fought the sky and won." The next morning, official confirmation arrived from the crash site. Investigators found the remains of his Lancaster, burned beyond recognition. His parachute melted into a tangled heap of fabric and metal, exactly where he said it would be. The Germans documented everything meticulously. Reports, photographs, witness accounts. Even the trees where his fall had broken were marked and measured. They didn't embellish or doubt, they verified. And for once, in the middle of a war built on lies and propaganda, the truth needed no help to sound unbelievable. Nicholas Alkmaid had fallen from 18,000 feet and lived, the legend spreads. Within weeks, the story had escaped the camp walls. First, it travelled by rumour, whispered between guards, traded like contraband among prisoners. But soon it reached Berlin, carried through official Luftwaffe channels marked "Exceptional Incident, Allied Airman Survival Report." The document was clinical, stamped with insignia and signed by multiple officers. Yet buried beneath its rigid language was something rare: admiration. Even the German intelligence summary included a line that seemed almost reluctant to admit the truth. Confirmed. British airmen survived free fall of approximately 18,000 feet without parachute. Sustained only minor injuries due to impact with snow and forest. Canopy. When the report reached higher command, it caused a small stir. German propaganda officers debated using it for morale, an example of British weakness, perhaps divine intervention gone astray. But the story didn't fit the narrative. It was too strange, too human, too pure to twist. Instead, the tale slipped quietly through unofficial channels, spreading through pilots' mess halls, maintenance crews, even frontline units. Soldiers spoke of the English ghost, the man who fell from the sky and lived. In the POW camp, the reaction was even stronger. Allied prisoners began to treat Nicholas like a living charm, a walking contradiction to death itself. They would joke, "If the guards start shooting, we're standing behind Alchemade." Nicholas hated the attention. He wasn't proud of it, only grateful. "I didn't outsmart death," he would say softly. "I just borrowed time." Still, every night before lights out, someone would ask to hear it again. And each time, he told it the same way, quietly, truthfully, never adding or taking away a detail. It wasn't a story anymore. It was something larger, a shared reminder that even in the most merciless machine of war, miracles still slipped through the cracks. Then, one morning, weeks later, a guard entered with a folded newspaper in hand. He placed it gently on the table in front of Nicholas. The headline read, "British Airman Survives Fall from 18,000 Feet, Verified by German Command," printed in both German and English. The article was short, factual, stripped of poetry, but its existence alone was extraordinary. In the middle of a war built on propaganda, an enemy nation had published the truth of a miracle belonging to the other side. That single newspaper became the most traded item in the camp. Men cut out the article and tucked it into their journals, their boots, their letters home. One pilot even said, "If this war ever ends, I'm keeping this to remind me that not everything fell that day." Nicholas folded his copy carefully and placed it in his pocket. He didn't need to read it again. He was living proof, walking evidence that sometimes the laws of war and nature both step aside for reasons no one can explain. The war ends. By the spring of 1945, the world around Nicholas was collapsing in slow motion. The guards grew quieter, the rations smaller, the radio whispers sharper. The Luftwaffe's arrogance, once ironclad, had dissolved into fatigue. The sky that had once carried their confidence was now filled with Allied bombers, endless and unchallenged. Inside the camp, everyone felt the change before it was spoken aloud. Orders grew inconsistent. Inspections became rare. Some guards simply vanished, leaving their posts in the night without farewell. And then, one morning in early April, the distant sound of artillery rolled across the horizon. Deep, rhythmic, unrelenting. The war, which had once been something far away, had finally come to the edges of the wire. The prisoners stood outside, silent, watching the smoke rise in the distance. Nicholas didn't speak. He just stared toward the faint rumble, realizing that the very machines that once hunted him from the air were now the instruments of liberation. A few days later, the gates were left open. No guards, no orders, just silence. The kind that doesn't feel peaceful but hollow. An American reconnaissance jeep arrived first. A soldier stepped out, raised his hand cautiously, and shouted through the barbed wire, "Any English here?" The answer came in a single roar, voices breaking, laughter spilling out, tears indistinguishable from mud. Nicholas watched it all from the back of the crowd. He didn't rush forward. When his turn came to shake the American's hand, he simply nodded and said, "Sergeant Nicholas Alchemade, RAF, Lancaster crew," fell out of the sky and got lost somewhere on the way down. The soldier blinked, confused. "You fell out?" Nicholas smiled faintly. Long story. In the days that followed, as trucks carried them through ruined towns and collapsed bridges, Nicholas looked out over a Europe reshaped by fire. Cities that had once been names on mission briefings were now skeletons of brick and steel. And yet, even amid the devastation, there were things that refused to die. Birds gliding over craters, flowers breaking through ash, laughter echoing from open truck beds, full of men who had every reason to stop believing in miracles. When Nicholas finally reached England weeks later, the first breath of home air felt heavier than he remembered. He reported to the RAF debriefing centre, gave his name, and waited to be processed like everyone else. The officer looked up from his paperwork halfway through, reading his file. "Wait," he said, squinting at the page. "You're the Alchemade?" Nicholas just nodded. The officer leaned back, let out a low whistle, and said the only thing anyone ever could in response to his story. Well, Sergeant, you must be made of luck and oak. Nicholas laughed for the first time in months. He didn't feel like a hero, just a man who had fallen into a story the world needed to hear, one that proved survival wasn't always about strength or skill. Sometimes it was just about landing where mercy waited. When the war ended, the world celebrated victory, but Nicholas Alcemade celebrated silence. For the first time in years, there were no air raid sirens, no engines droning through the night, no sky on fire, just stillness. He returned to England a different man, not broken, but strangely at peace. Most veterans carried invisible wounds from what they had done. Nicholas carried his from what he had survived. The RAF invited him to speak at briefings and veterans' gatherings. Newspapers called him the man who fell from the sky. Some wanted him to tour, to tell the story publicly, to make it a legend while it was still fresh. But Nicholas refused. He didn't want fame. He wanted to be forgotten by the noise. He found work in a factory that made glass instruments for laboratories. A quiet, meticulous trade where everything depended on precision and patience. It suited him. The hiss of the gas torch, the steady turn of molten glass. It was the opposite of the chaos he had known. His co-workers often joked, "Careful, Nick, you've fallen before. We can't lose you again." He would grin, shake his head, and reply, "Don't worry, lads. I'm keeping my feet on the ground now." But every year, when March came around, he would find himself standing outside under the open sky, looking up without meaning to. He said once to a friend, "When I look up there, I don't see clouds anymore. I see time, the time I borrowed." Over the years, his story resurfaced again and again. Books mentioned it. Documentaries tried to dramatize it. Skeptics tried to disprove it. But the original Luftwaffe documentation and Allied verification remained intact. It had happened, every improbable second of it. Yet Nicholas never tried to explain why he survived. When asked, he would simply shrug and say, "If you believe in luck, call it that. If you believe in God, call it that. Me, I just call it mercy." He married quietly in 1948, raised a family, lived an unremarkable life by every visible measure. But those who knew him said there was something in his eyes, a calmness that only comes from having looked at death in the face and found something gentler staring back. Years later, when aviation historians tried to track him down for interviews, Nicholas politely declined most of them. He said, "You don't need me for the story. The story tells itself. It just happened to borrow my name." And he was right. Because his survival wasn't just about one man falling through the sky. It was about what refused to die inside humanity when the world was tearing itself apart. Courage, luck, faith, call it what you will. But it made even gravity blink for a moment. The physics of a miracle. For decades, people tried to explain what had happened to Nicholas Alcemade. Scientists, engineers, even physicists obsessed with probability. Because what he survived wasn't just improbable, it was, by every known law, impossible. 18,000 feet. That's more than 3 miles of sky. A human body falling from that height reaches over 120 miles per hour before terminal velocity stabilizes. At that speed, even water feels like concrete. Snow, barely a cushion. And yet, Nicholas lived. No broken bones, no internal bleeding, just a sprained leg. So how? Experts who studied the records proposed a combination of unlikely factors. The heavy snow had a dense, layered crust from recent thaw and freeze cycles, not too hard to stop him instantly, but strong enough to slow his fall gradually. The pine trees beneath had long, flexible branches that broke sequentially, each one robbing a little more speed before giving way. And finally, his unconscious body, limp rather than rigid, absorbed the impact more efficiently, like a falling cloth rather than a crashing stone. Altogether, it created what one physicist described as the narrowest thread of survival imaginable. He concluded, if any one of those factors had changed by even 1%, he would have died instantly. But what science couldn't quantify was what Nicholas himself understood better than anyone. You don't walk away from something like that just because physics allowed it. You walk away because, for reasons beyond reason, the universe let you. Later studies compared his case with that of other rare survivors, flight attendants, paratroopers, civilians who had fallen from aircraft or buildings under extraordinary circumstances. Most of them shared one common trait: survival through chaos they didn't control. They weren't saved by reflexes, or gear, or design. They were saved by something quieter, something intangible. A professor at Cambridge once said in a lecture, "In every rule of science, there is room for grace." And maybe that's what Nicholas's fall was. The one moment where gravity, nature, and fate all paused to let grace through. The most haunting part wasn't the miracle itself, though. It was what followed, because from that day onward, Nicholas never feared falling again. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, not even in dreams. He told a friend decades later, people spend their lives afraid of falling, in love, in failure, in life. I did it once and it didn't kill me. Everything since has just felt like landing softer. Even the Luftwaffe's records, clinical and emotionless, couldn't erase that truth. They proved he fell, but they could never explain why he lived. And maybe that's the real point. The laws of nature tell us what should happen, but the laws of grace remind us. Sometimes something greater decides otherwise. When the sky remembered. Decades passed. The war became memory, then history, then chapters in school books. But for Nicholas, the sky never lost its voice. Every time a thunderstorm rolled across England, he'd sit by his window and watch. The same way he once watched the burning night over Germany. Sometimes when the lightning flashed, his wife would ask softly, "Does it remind you?" And he'd answer, "No, it remembers me." He wasn't being poetic. He meant it. Because after what he had seen, the sky wasn't just weather anymore. It was alive. It had been his enemy, his executioner, and his savior all at once. In 1970, the BBC reached out to him for a documentary on incredible survival stories. They offered him payment, airtime, and even a chance to visit the site in Germany where he fell. For a long time, he refused. Then one day, he said yes. Not for fame, but for closure. When the crew arrived at the forest near Berlin, locals guided them through a pine valley that hadn't changed much in 30 years. The air was still, the snow quiet. The trees, the same kind that had caught him, stood like silent witnesses to an old miracle. Nicholas walked a few paces ahead of the crew, stopped and looked up. For a moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, "This is where gravity gave up." The cameraman zoomed in on his face. The same calm eyes, now wrinkled and kind. "You know," Nicholas said, almost to himself, "I think the sky forgave me that night. It didn't want to kill me. It just wanted to remind me who's in charge." When the documentary aired, millions watched in stunned silence. Some cried, some doubted, some replayed the footage again and again, trying to understand how a man could fall through war and snow and still speak with such peace. In one short interview clip that never aired but remained in BBC archives, the journalist asked him, "Do you believe in fate, Mr. Alkmaid?" He smiled. "No, I believe in balance. The sky took so many. Maybe it just decided to give one back." That single line became the closing quote of the program. The sky took so many, it gave one back. Letters poured in from across the world. Pilots, soldiers, widows, survivors, people who had lost everything and needed to believe that even in the ugliest parts of war, mercy could still find its way through. For Nicholas, that was enough. He didn't need applause. He didn't need disbelief proven wrong. He just wanted to remind the world that sometimes, when everything falls apart, you might just fall into the one thing that saves you. The weight of memory. Memory is a strange companion. It doesn't age, it doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. Nicholas Alkmaid carried his memory not like a burden, but like an old medal, tarnished, yet too sacred to clean. He never spoke much about the bombing runs. He didn't talk about the faces of the men he lost that night, or how the sky over Berlin looked when it was on fire. People who met him later in life thought of him as gentle, reserved, but behind his quiet eyes was a mind that still heard engines, flak bursts, and the tearing metal of his descent. One of his crew members, a man who'd been in another bomber that night, visited him years later. They hadn't seen each other in decades. Over tea, the man asked, "Do you still dream of it?" Nicholas stared at the table for a while. Then he said, "Not anymore. The dream stopped when I forgave the sky." Forgiveness, that was something no one expected to hear from a bomber. He had seen entire cities vanish beneath him. He had watched tracer fire climb toward his crew, like fiery vines. He knew what it meant to deliver death from above, and maybe that's why, when he fell, life itself decided to return the favor. For years, he kept a small object in his drawer, a twisted, blackened fragment of metal. It was part of his parachute harness, fused by the heat of the fire that should have killed him. Whenever people asked why he kept it, he'd answer, "Because it reminds me how close I came to forgetting what living feels like." He wasn't haunted. He was anchored. Every Remembrance Day, when veterans stood in silence, Nicholas would stand among them, not as a hero, not as a miracle, but as proof that even in destruction, something sacred survives. Once, a young reporter asked him, "Do you ever feel guilty that you lived when so many didn't?" Nicholas replied softly, "Every day, but I've learned that guilt and gratitude are sometimes the same thing, wearing different faces." There was no arrogance in his survival, no pride, no myth-making, just a man who understood that he had been spared not to boast, but to remember. Because sometimes the world doesn't need another hero, it needs a witness. And that's what Nicholas became, a witness to gravity's surrender, to war's madness, and to mercy's quiet return, when legends fade. By the time the 1980s arrived, Nicholas Alcemaide's story had become something of a ghost itself, retold in war books, quoted in lectures, and whispered by historians who still couldn't believe it really happened. Most people didn't know his name anymore, but they knew the legend, the man who fell from the sky and lived. And maybe that's exactly how he wanted it, because Nicholas never cared about being remembered. He cared about remembering. When his children were old enough, they once asked him why there were no medals or photos from the war on display. He simply said, "Because the sky already remembers me. I don't need to remind it." But history has a way of circling back. In 1987, a British aviation historian named Martin Caidin, known for verifying impossible survival stories, came across Nicholas's case while researching aircrew bailout incidents. Expecting another wartime exaggeration, he dug into archives in both Britain and Germany. What he found left him silent. The Luftwaffe crash report existed, complete with coordinates, witness statements, and even the German commander's handwritten note. English airman claims to have fallen without parachute from 18,000 feet. Injuries minor. Investigation confirms no parachute was found. Statement believed as genuine. That one line from the enemy itself froze him. Caidin tracked Nicholas down to his quiet home in Norfolk. When he arrived, Nicholas was tending a small garden, trimming hedges with the same calm precision he once used on flight instruments. When told that the story had resurfaced, Nicholas chuckled softly and said, "I suppose miracles don't like to stay buried?" Caidin asked if he could publish it again, this time with documentation and photographs. Proof for a new generation that it wasn't a myth. Nicholas agreed under one condition. "Tell it straight. Don't turn it into something I'm not. I didn't beat death. It just passed me by that night." When the article was published, it reignited global fascination. Newspapers reprinted it, radio shows discussed it, and even veteran circles across Europe honored him again. But unlike the heroes in statues or medals, Nicholas remained untouched by fame. He told Caidin, "It's funny, isn't it? The things people call a miracle, I just call it another night that ended differently." As the years faded, so did the noise. He grew older, slower, but never bitter. He had made peace, with war, with gravity, with the sky. And when he died quietly in June 1987, age 64, it wasn't front-page news, just a small line in the local paper. Nicholas Alcemaide, RAF veteran, passed away peacefully at home. But somewhere, above the clouds where his story began, the sky must have remembered. Because legends like that don't really end. They just keep falling softly through time, landing again in every heart that hears them. The legacy of a fall. Nicholas Alcmeid's story didn't vanish with him. It lingered like contrails against the sky that refused to fade. In museums, documentaries, and aviation circles, his fall became more than a miracle. It became a mirror, reflecting what war can't destroy. The sheer, unexplainable will to live. Today, if you walk through the RAF Museum in London, there's a small exhibit titled Survival Against All Odds. Among the artifacts, rusted flight goggles, bent fuselage panels, faded logbooks, there's a single black and white photograph of a young airman with calm eyes and a crooked grin. Below it, the caption reads, Nicholas Alcmeid survived a fall from 18,000 feet without a parachute. March 24th, 1944. No fanfare, no exaggeration, just the fact, because the fact alone defies imagination. What people don't see, though, is what came after. His story quietly inspired hundreds of airmen, survival instructors, and pilots across generations. In RAF survival courses, cadets are still told, if Alcmeid could fall and live, you can fight and survive. It's not just a quote, it's a mantra. Even outside the military, his name appears in places he never imagined. In psychology lectures about resilience, in philosophy discussions on fate, even in sermons about grace. Because his story isn't about physics or luck, it's about surrender. He didn't fight the fall, he accepted it. And in doing so, somehow, life caught him. In 2014, 70 years after his descent, a group of British historians revisited the site where he landed. They found remnants of old pine trees, fragments of wartime debris, and snow that still fell softly in spring, as if the forest itself was guarding its secret. They placed a small plaque there, engraved with words Nicholas once said to a friend, I didn't fall to die, I fell to live. No monument could have captured it better, because the legacy of Nicholas Alcmeid isn't about surviving a fall, it's about what that survival meant in a world built on destruction. He proved that even when everything collapses, when the engines fail, the fire burns, the parachute tears, something within us still chooses life. And maybe that's why his story endures. Because it reminds us that not all miracles roar. Some whisper, some fall, and some, like Nicholas Alcmeid, simply refuse to break. The war ended long ago. The bombers are gone. The skies are quiet. But somewhere, above the clouds, the universe still remembers that night when one man fell through fire and landed in peace.